Our story today is a story that foreshadows World War II. It takes place in China, and it's a dirty story. One of those actions that are claimed but then are followed by excuses. It's a story with some dark sides. It's a story where something doesn't add up in the final reckoning. And we're not talking exclusively about the victims. It's a story that involves the Japanese Empire and the United States of America 4 years before Pearl Harbor. It's a story that's not often told in the West, even though we Italians have at least one reason to know it. We should know it very well, because this story also involves Italians, Italian journalists to be exact, who found themselves unwillingly at the center of a very unpleasant affair. During the 1930s, mainland China was the scene of increasing aggression. A Japanese aggression that began in 1931 with the invasion and conquest of Manchuria, and then what is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, which broke out in the summer of 1937. The city of Nanjing, the capital of nationalist China, became during that period the center of one of the most tragic chapters of the conflict. The Japanese advance culminated in the massacre known as the Nanjing Massacre, a slaughter that lasted for days, and at the time shocked world public opinion. In this context, the United States maintained a naval presence on the Yangtze River, a protection for their own interests, but also a protection for their citizens present in China for their properties. It was the so-called Yangtze Patrol. The Yangtze Patrol, a group of armed riverboats flying the United States flag, whose only job was to patrol the river and protect American interests in the area. One of these ships, the United States ship Panay, the Optical Patrol River 5, is the protagonist of our story today. It's a river gunboat commissioned in 1928 with a full load displacement of 450 tons. It has a length of about 58 meters, a draft of 1.6 meters, and is armed with 2 3-inch cannons and 10 machine guns. A light ship that on December 11, 1937, was assigned a special mission to help evacuate American citizens and allies from the danger zone. From the Nanjing area where the situation is deteriorating, the operational context on the Yangtze in those days is extremely complex. The river fleet operates in conditions of civil war, Japanese presence, the threat of raiders, and with the specter of artillery batteries on land that can suddenly target the river. In those days, the United States issued the order to evacuate citizens and diplomats from the Nanjing perimeter before the final assault of the Japanese troops on the city. On the morning of December 12, 1937, the United States ship Panay is stationed on the Yangtze River, about 28 miles north of Nanjing. Together with her, there are 3 people from the Standard Oil Company, one of the major American oil companies. They are evacuating Chinese employees and their families. The United States ship Panay sails on the river with 2 large American flags painted on the tarps covering the decks, and of course it has the national American flag raised on the mast. On board are 5 officers, 54 enlisted men, 4 United States Embassy officials, and 10 civilians. Among them are several cameramen journalists from Universal Newsreel, Ramal Ali. Then there's Eric Mail from Movietone News, Norman Sung from the New York Times, and Jim Marshall, correspondent for Collier's Weekly, and the 2 Italians, both well-known countrymen. The correspondent for Corriere della Sera, Luigi Barzini, one of the finest writers in Italian journalism, and his colleague from La Stampa, Sandro Sandri. And it is precisely these journalists, except for one, as we will see shortly, who document what happens that day on the Yangtze. The Japanese troops are still advancing more and more, and the sky is dominated exclusively by the Japanese Navy Air Force. Despite the United States ship Panay being clearly marked with those flags, the Japanese planes attack it. In 2 waves, Yokosuka B-4Y Type 96 bombers drop bombs from high altitude, then Nakajima A-4N fighters arrive and carry out a low-altitude strafing run. The Panay suffers 2 direct hits that heavily damage the superstructure and main body, causing injuries, some deaths, and leading to the ship's evacuation. The attack lasts for a total of 20 to 30 minutes, and the bombs dropped caused significant damage. But not satisfied with this, the Japanese pilots swoop down to strafe the crew at low altitude until the ship, which is taking on water, is abandoned and sinks. The survivors swim to shore, wait for rescue, but most importantly, they take a head count to see who is missing. At roll call, there are 3 American casualties: Private First Class Charles Lee Elsminger and boiler operator Edward Halsebus, who is severely wounded and dies that night. The captain of the oil tanker from Standard Oil, Carl Carlson. And finally, an Italian, Sandro Sandri, whose body is recovered from the Yangtze with unmistakable signs and a burst of machine gun fire on his body. There are these victims, plus 48 wounded, 43 military, and 5 civilians. The Standard Oil tankers are also hit by the Japanese Air Force. They are bombed and severely damaged. There are several victims among the Chinese employees, but no one records them. From a diplomatic point of view, it's a disaster. The relations between the United States and Japan, already far from ideal, quickly get worse. The United States is absolutely neutral at that time in China. They are only protecting their own citizens and evacuating them. There is no war declaration or cause for conflict between the Japanese Empire and the United States. For what reason did those Japanese planes decide to attack the United States ship Panay and the oil tankers on the river? Officially, the Japanese government claims that it was a mistake. The pilots supposedly didn't see the American flags and mistook the Panay for a Chinese ship. How can we believe them? The flags weren't invisible. They were huge, painted on tarps. On December 24, 1937, Japan issued its official apology. It offered reparations to the United States in the form of a $2 million loan of that time. That's enough to formally close the incident. But is that all? No, that's not all, because we can't end our story here. In fact, several modern analysts believe that the attack was not random or accidental. It was absolutely intentional, or at least Japanese policy in China was such that mistakes like these, if we want to call them that, were quite plausible. To confirm this, some United States cryptographic intercepts that have now become available suggest that the Japanese planes were operating under conditions that implied an awareness of the target. They knew very well that the United States ship Panay was an American ship, but they hit it anyway. It was common practice during the Second Sino-Japanese War for the Japanese to attack Western targets as well, using the excuse that there were Chinese targets on board, and therefore they were legitimate. But this incident, the United States ship Panay incident, if we still want to call it an incident, represents a significant episode of what was happening in the Far East in the immediately preceding period. World War II was a period when China was torn apart by internal wars between the warlords, in which Nazi Germany offered a military mission of observers, instructors, and war material not to the Japanese, but to China. And it's a mission that will be recalled after Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire reach an agreement on the international recognition of Manchukuo. But the Panay incident primarily represents an attack on an American ship during a conflict in which the United States was not actively participating. And it highlighted the fragility of neutral positions in East Asia. Not only is the Panay incident a precursor to the naval and air clashes between Japan and the United States before the actual outbreak of war between the two countries. Even though it was a minor episode, and even though it can't be compared to Pearl Harbor in terms of casualties, tonnage hit, or damage caused, it is still a precedent. Above all, the Panay incident highlights the complex diplomatic ties among the United States, Japan, and China in the 1930s. If the Americans protect their economic interests and their own citizens, the American and Western military presence is dramatically insufficient. And this increases what is called the neutrality dilemma in a context of asymmetric warfare. Despite the outrage of United States public opinion, the official American response has remained moderate. At the time, the administration did not decide to declare war on Japan, and diplomatic relations were restored after an apology and compensation. However, politically, that incident contributed to worsening the negative perception of Japan, making it more difficult for Tokyo to present itself as a benevolent power in the Asian context. or even just to have its imperialistic claims over continental East Asia accepted internationally. From that day on, many Americans began to question Japan's role in China and the vulnerability of United States interests outside their own borders from a strictly military perspective. The Panay incident reminded the United States Navy of the importance of deployment in riverine and island theaters, of convoy protection and the gap between declarations of neutrality and the reality of air attacks. From a historical perspective, the Panay incident has been studied as a sort of prologue, albeit a minor one, to the events of World War II in the Pacific, a sign that Japanese expansion in Asia would inevitably collide with Western interests. The very fact that sometime after the Panay incident, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, dismissed a measure to ban any petroleum products and their derivatives from being sent to Japan. It is a further consequence of the Japanese aggression and of the fact that the perception of this aggression has always been viewed extremely negatively, not just towards China, but the whole world. Yet, as we were saying, the Panay incident is extremely difficult to remember even for us, despite the death of Sandro Sandri. For what reason? Well, there was no immediate military reaction. There was no retaliation. The river theater then and the evacuation operation are definitely less conspicuous, if you'll allow me the term, compared to a large-scale military operation. The direct consequences of the sinking of the United States ship Panay themselves were contained thanks to the apologies presented to the Japanese government and the compensation paid, as if they were merely minor acts of guilt. Then consider the Panay incident, compared to what happened after the massacres in China, to what was done in Manchukuo, and then, of course, World War II. It's clear that this is a very small episode, destined to be overshadowed from a media perspective. Yet the Panay incident represents a micro-crisis that came between the policy of appeasement and neutrality in the 1930s, a policy that would reach its peak, as we've already seen in another video you can find on the channel. At the Munich Conference in 1938 and the imminent catastrophe of World War II, which in the Pacific would see extremely dramatic events unfold. Not only does that episode highlight the fragility of the very concept of neutrality, the danger of aggressive expansion, and the interconnection between economic interests, military presence, and of course diplomatic relations. The United States of America, committed to protecting its citizens and economic activities abroad, found itself powerless in the face of the attack on that occasion. Although they were not yet at war, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression and did not have a military force strong enough to even consider sending an expeditionary force to protect its citizens. Abroad, they mainly relied on small contingents and, above all, on the deterrent effect of diplomatic rules. Japan, for its part, showed itself on that occasion, even in the presence of clearly marked vessels like the United States ship Panay, as an aggressive power. The military action was decided and carried out regardless of the presence or absence of neutral citizens and military forces. In a certain sense, the episode of the United States ship Panay, which we have tried to bring to light today with all its implications, with all its drama, it foreshadowed what would happen a few years later. On a larger scale, a clash between American interests, but also British, Dutch, and French interests in the Pacific area, and a Japanese power. A Japanese imperialism that certainly could not be appeased with economic proposals alone. When two spheres of influence clash, equally powerful and equally aspiring to create their own exclusive world, nothing but armed conflict can result. The Panay incident was not even an appetizer, just a prelude to what would happen later, of what would be seen in Shanghai both in 1937, 1938, and then in 1941, of what would be seen in Hong Kong in 1941 or Singapore in 1942. All of that had already happened there on the Yangtze, the beautiful river that runs through central China, on that December morning. While in Europe, people watched the German rearmament with concern. While in Europe, people looked with even greater concern at the Soviet Revolution. In the Far East, an empire thirsty for natural resources, for labor force, practically slave labor, for power, for an exclusive sphere of influence. It was committing a crime, an international crime, a deliberate crime, not an accidental one, a crime whose outcome would, in a way, authorize the perpetrators to use even more, and more, to the point of wanting to collide with the rest of the world in the absurd belief that they could succeed once again. Invincible and unpunished, welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for contemporary history lovers. You've known us for a while, but for newcomers, I'd like to explain some details about Dentro la Storia. It's an educational channel that you can find on YouTube, but it's also a podcast platform that you can find on Spotify or on other platforms for audio content. It's also an official website where you can find all our audio, video, and even text content. And it's a newsletter, a completely free monthly newsletter, which you can request in a dedicated section of the website, and that arrives in each subscriber's email inbox at the beginning of the month.